Hi, everyone. My name's Kevin, and this month we're going to be talking about Blood in My Eye by George Jackson. This was originally published in 1972. The copy that I'm holding here in my hands was published in 1990. Just a reminder about the format of this video. I'm going to be talking about a few key points from the book. I'm going to be giving a bit of my own analysis and hopefully open it up for a discussion for your own. This is not a replacement for reading the book. This is not a replacement for your own discussion. The only way that you can truly understand this book is by reading it yourself and discussing it with your group. That said, this book, probably more than any of the others that we're going to be talking about in this study group, is the one that I recommend that people actually sit down and read the most. So I'm going to give a little introduction to this book, and after that, if it seems like it's something that you might be interested in, I invite you to just go ahead and shut this video off and read it yourself. You're not going to hurt my feelings, I swear. Number one, this book is a collection of letters written by George Jackson from prison in 1971. So the style of it is really casual. It's really easy to get into. He is repeating himself. I don't mean this in a negative way, but he repeats the same points throughout the book. So it's really easy to grasp what it is that he's talking about. Um, Moreover, this book is something that I think everybody needs to read at a certain point in their revolutionary journey, right? The reason that I say this, the reason is that this book changed my beliefs. And I don't mean beliefs in terms of like ideology or like what I think. I mean, it changed my beliefs in a religious sense. It gave me faith. By that, I mean, there gets to be a point, I think, whenever you start studying socialism, communism, social justice, progressivism, things like that, where you start to believe that things will never change. And so you start making your own little compromises and you start telling yourself that things will never actually get better. The problems that we're facing are too big. The military and the police are too powerful. The governments are too powerful. People are too stupid. People are too selfish. Nobody cares. Everybody kind of gets to this point. And for me, this book got me over that hill. And so I really want everybody to read this book at some point. Uh, we all kind of have this image of someone who studies Marxism as being maybe like this stoic old white guy sitting in a leather chair, like smoking a pipe or whatever, reading up on, 19th century economic papers in the original German, whatever, right? Or we imagine them to be like the granola munching teenagers with the Che Guevara t-shirt, just kids playing around. George Jackson, I think, is the antithesis to both of those ideas. He was not a traditionally educated man. As far as I can tell, he didn't graduate high school. He never went to university. Everything that he did, he was entirely self-taught. Truly a genius, truly an autodidact. But moreover, it sort of breaks down the barrier where we assume that communism, Marxism, socialism, social justice are things that only a certain type of person understands, and that there are lots of different type of people that can't understand it. So George Jackson, I think for me, I think I have like 4 or 5 more degrees and diplomas than he has. I'm not a dumb guy, but he sitting alone in a jail cell reading by himself is able to teach me so much. Such a titan of a man, and such a great loss to all of us whenever he was murdered. And so really, really changed my opinion about who can be a Marxist and who should be a Marxist. Moreover, if you're like me, you sort of understand that things need to change, and you start to slowly understand that those don't change through reform. Liberal reformist ideas don't work. For the most part, they're entirely, depending on whether or not you agree with me, but electoral politics don't work at all. And so these things need to be changed in a big way. They require big revolutionary changes, not small incremental ones, but big world changing ideas that will shift everything that we know. And when you're faced with that, it gets to be a little intimidating because you know that you're facing off against your billionaires, you're facing off against the police, you're facing off against the military. All of these people have a lot more money, a lot more power, a lot more influence, a lot more military might than we do. George Jackson takes that particular problem throughout this entire book and shows that it truly is a paper tiger. This one for me made me believe that facing off against a giant military industrial complex is not necessarily a scary, challenging, or impossible thing. We're going to talk more about it as we go, but like that belief that things are not only capable of being changed, but that it is well within our grasp to do so, and we don't need as much power as they have to actually do it. Really, really beautiful. So again, at this point, if I've struck your interest, if what I've just said resonates with you, shut off this video, go read this book by yourself. I promise you it'll change your life much more than listening to me talk on YouTube. So please go do that. If you've already read this book, or if you just want to listen to me talk, let's get into it. So here we go. Okay, so to get into this book, we need to understand a lot about George Jackson's personal life and his history. George Jackson was born in Chicago, Illinois. He starts getting into trouble as a teenager, so his father decides to move him out of Chicago and into California. This doesn't help. He gets arrested at the age of 15. He spends a couple years in juvenile detention. When he gets out at the age of 18, he robs a convenience store and steals $70. As a result of this, he is incarcerated for the next 11 years of his life until he gets murdered in jail. As we go forward, as we're talking about George Jackson's life in prison, we need to remember that he spent his entire adult life in prison until his murder over $70. $70 US. That's it. So he gives his own little biography of himself on page 7 of the book. This one says, born to a premature death, a menial subsistence wage worker, odd job man, the cleaner, the caught, the man under the hatches without bail. That's me, the colonial victim. Anyone who can pass the civil service examination today can kill me tomorrow. Anyone who passed the civil service examination yesterday can kill me today with complete immunity. I've lived with oppression every moment of my life, a repression so formidable that any movement on my part can only bring relief, the respite of a small victory or the release of death. In every sense of the term, in every sense that's real, I'm a slave to and of property. This one. So, as we said, he spent his entire life in prison, and I wanted to share a little bit from the introduction written by Gregory Armstrong about that incarceration and how terrible it was. This one, he describes being put into solitary confinement, and Gregory Armstrong describes it this way. He was a 6 by 8 cell with no protection from wet weather, deprived of all items with which he might clean himself, forced to eat in the stench and filth caused by his own body wastes, allowed to wash his hands only once every 5 days, and required to sleep on a stiff canvas mat placed directly on the cold canvas floor. This definition of his solitary confinement always stuck out with me. I've heard lots of horror stories of torture and imprisonment before. I don't know what it is, but the fact that he was only allowed to wash his hands once every 5 days really stuck with me. I'm not sure why. To continue, George Jackson describes being in prison like this. Try to remember how you felt at the most depressing moment of your life, the moment of your deepest dejection. That is how I feel all the time. No matter what level my consciousness may be, asleep, awake, in between, the thing is there and it keeps me moving, pins my eye to the ball uptight 24 hours a day. I wanted to start off the book reading these sections to talk about how terrible his life was. How terrible his life was. I think I can say that. What a terrible life that he had. What an unfair, unjust life that he had. But as we'll see, he had the fighting spirit in him. It's really, really astonishing to think about what he went through for 11 years. Again, his entire adult life, over $70 from a 7-Eleven gas store, gas station, convenience store, whatever, that he spent so much time being tormented and he still had so much belief that things could get better, I think is extremely inspiring to say the least. So let's talk about next his brother John. All right, let's talk a little bit about George Jackson's younger brother, Jonathan Jackson, who is arguably just as famous as George Jackson. As a result of George Jackson's treatment in prison, Jonathan, his younger brother, who was 16 years old at the time, I might be mistaken on that, so I might double check that later, but 16 years old or 17 years old at the time, decides to take a few hostages from a local courthouse and he gets killed in the process. It's not really in the content of the book, but Jonathan Jackson was also a true revolutionary. He was also somebody who was fighting for justice, and he ends up killed because of it. Those events happen in 1970, right before George Jackson starts writing the letters that are going to comprise Blood in My Eye. And so Jonathan's death and his words and his ideas, I think, are very, very fresh in George Jackson's mind as he writes this. There's a few sections where he quotes heavily from Jonathan Jackson. So to introduce Jonathan, I wanted to share two quotes from George Jackson about his brother. This one says, "I haven't shed one tear. I'm too proud for that. A beautiful, beautiful man-child with a submachine gun. He knew how to be with people. I loved Jonathan, but his death only sharpens my fighting spirit. I'm proud just to have known that he was flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood." As we continue further, the idea of violence and the idea of death and the idea of dying a good death is going to be present all throughout Blood in My Eye. And I think it's really important that that starts with George Jackson thinking about Jonathan's death. I wanted to share one more quote that I really, really like because I found it to be beautiful. George Jackson says on page 103, "I feel elated that my brother died with two guns in hand. I miss him intensely, but he and the others who sought freedom died at the throat of the principal repressive institution of the empire. They died making real attempts at freedom." I paraphrase Castro on trial after Moncada. Moncada? "I warn you, gentlemen, I have only begun." Really, really beautiful quote that I just messed up, so hopefully you still get the impression. Like I said, read the book yourself. Another one of Blood in My Eyes side characters is Huey P. Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party, who writes the afterword to Blood in My Eye. It's no stretch of the imagination to say that Huey P. Newton was influenced heavily by George Jackson's ideas. He says so himself, but you can see quite a bit through Huey P. Newton's writings. He talks a lot about this idea of a revolutionary self. I don't know if I can say these words on YouTube. He talks about a revolutionary self-destruction, which is sort of sacrificing your life for the greater good instead of losing your life out of despair. Another thing that George Jackson himself also wrote about. So I'm going to read a little bit about Huey's discussion about George Jackson. He says, "When I went to prison in 1967, I met George, not physically, but through his ideas, his thoughts, and words." And just a reminder, the Black Panther Party was formed in 1966. It's probably no stretch of the imagination that Huey P. Newton was sort of still formulating what the Black Panther Party would become, and that his ideas would be influenced by George Jackson's influence. Let me continue here. I met George through his spirit. I say that the legendary figure is also a hero. George Jackson was my hero. He set a standard for prisoners, political prisoners, for people. He showed the love, the strength, the revolutionary fervor that's characteristic of any soldier for the people. He inspired prisoners, whom I later encountered, to put his ideas into practice, and so his spirit became a living thing. Today, I say that although George's body has fallen, his spirit goes on because his ideas live, and how true that is. So that's great. Let's keep going. Okay, so let's start talking about some of George Jackson's political ideas. We're going to focus in on three right now. His ideas about reformism, his ideas about activism, and his ideas about electoralism. Let's get started first with a quote on page 7. This one starts with revolution within a modern industrial capitalist society can only mean the overthrow of all existing property relations and the destruction of all institutions that directly or indirectly support existing property relations. It must include the total suppression of all classes and individuals who endorse the present state of property relations or who stand to gain from it. Anything less than this is reform. So, like we said before, straight out of Lenin, this idea against being reformist solutions. To continue on page 118, he says, we will never have a complete definition of fascism because it is in constant motion, showing a new face to fit any particular set of problems that arise to threaten the predominance of the traditionalist capitalist ruling class. But if one were forced, for the sake of clarity, to define it in a word simple enough for all to understand, that word would be reform. We can make our definition more precise by adding the word economic. Economic reform comes very close to a working definition of fascist motive forces. Really, really strong statements here. Let's continue. Let's talk about activism. When I say activism here, I'm using Paulo Freire's definition of doing things or having a protest or a demonstration or raising awareness without actually thinking about what you're doing and without actually having any goals in mind. So on page 11, to get started, he says, the period of disorganized activity of riots and rallies and purely political agitation / education has come to a close. The violence of the opposition has brought it to an end. On page 26, he talks about like modern protest culture, and he doesn't have a lot of nice things to say about it. So at a protest, this one. Years ago, it may have been an acceptable tactic to organize a people's ticket of solid worker and revolutionary credentials and arm it with an ideal platform. Talking about electoral politics, by the way. Only to be defeated by a mudslinging, opportunist warlord, demonstrably inferior, scum-swelling pig. Then pass out a pamphlet to explain to the people how the system has failed them, or speak it in Pershing Square, or years ago in the campus hall. Today, it is not a tactic, it's counter-revolution. This one, all the things that we keep doing where we get on TikTok, we get on Instagram, we get on Twitter or whatever, and we just like raise awareness is just the modern day equivalent of passing out pamphlets, explaining to people that the system isn't working to them. They know. The people know that the system isn't working to them and it's insufficient. I would call it insufficient. George Jackson calls it counter-revolution. You are actually working against the forces that are going to create a revolution by the people. Finally, let's talk a little bit about electoral politics in general, which he also has a lot of negative things to say. On page 26, he says, when any election is held, it will fortify rather than destroy the credibility of the power brokers. When we participate in this election to win instead of disrupt, we're lending to its credibility and destroying our own. Participating in the system doesn't change it. It only makes the system more powerful. To continue on page 28, this one, which is a really, really biting quote that I like, George Wallace or Adolf Hitler would fare better at the polls of an honest election than Huey Newton or Tom Hayden. So I think he's right. An honest fascist, an honest racist, an honest white supremacist will always do better in elections than an honest to goodness socialist. So good stuff. Okay, let's quickly talk about some of George Jackson's ideas about theory and ideology. Um, you might get the impression, if you read this book, that George Jackson was someone who enjoyed violence just for the sake of violence. He certainly talks about it. He doesn't shy away from it, and he's not afraid of talking about violence. He wasn't afraid of doing violence. But that said, he also says that it's important to study. It's important to hit the books. You need to have all of your actions based on communist ideology, communist theory. So to get started, at the beginning of the book on page 3, he says, I was hoping that you wouldn't get trapped in the riot stage like a great many other sincere brothers. I have to browbeat them every day down here. They think they don't need ideology, strategy, or tactics. They think being a warrior is quite enough. Um, my general opinion of the modern left, right now, the left, whatever that means, is that a lot of people are eager to act. They're not organized, but what they really, really need is more theory. They need more studying. I just read a great history book about Cuba, and one of the anecdotes that really stuck out at me was Fidel Castro in prison basically set up a school for the prisoners where they spend all day studying history, economics, and politics, and they had like little speech competitions and things like that. They had homework, you know. And so George Jackson is touching upon that here, is that it's not just enough to be a fighter. You also have to be someone who thinks. You have to be someone who studies. You need theory and ideology. To continue on page 23, he explains a little bit more. Um, After we are done with our books, they must be put aside, and the search for method will depend on observations, correct analyses, creativity, and seizing the time. You need both, right? You need to be studying and you need to be thinking about what to do. But the key point is that you are always thinking. To continue, I really like this one quote. If I could get one quote put on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt or whatever, it might be this one. If a thing is not building, it is certainly decaying. That life is revolution, that the world will die if we don't read and act out its imperatives. If a thing is not building, it is decaying. If we are not working on building worker power right now, our power is decaying. I hope that sticks with you as it does with me. So I'm recording this section right now to maybe sort of circumvent YouTube censors, but let's talk about the Bronze Age collapse. You remember that I'm a history teacher, so the Bronze Age collapse happens roughly 12th century BCE. This is where a lot of civilizations just kind of suddenly collapsed, just as the name implies. A lot of people don't really know the exact reason. There's some references to a group of people called the Sea Peoples and their particular way of fighting that seem to have brought down all of these large civilizations. To explain a little bit further, and again, remember that we're speaking euphemistically here. During the Bronze Age, the preferred weapon of war was the chariot. It was a hugely expensive at the time piece of equipment that was essentially operated by two people. There was a driver and there's a guy in the back with a bow and arrow and two horses, right? For a long time, warfare was fought basically between a chariot and a group of guys standing around with spears, and the chariot would always win, or against two chariots, and then the chariots would kind of like fight against each other, and they were pretty evenly matched until the Sea People come along, and the thinking goes, again, this is 3,000 years ago, so who knows, but the thinking goes that the Sea Peoples had a kind of hit and run style of fighting where they would run around kind of like willy-nilly, kind of randomly with javelins in their hands. And if you take out one section of the chariot, you take out one of the operators, you take out one of the horses, you take out one of the wheels, the whole chariot is destroyed. Now, again, thinking about 2026 technology, equipment, drones, things like that. Any small part of these expensive, super expensive, millions of dollars of pieces of equipment, any one small part of that that gets destroyed, the whole thing is obsolete and useless. So that's my way of getting around the YouTube censors in case they don't want me to talk about what George Jackson says. So we'll see. All right, let's talk about violence. Violence, the concept of violence, features quite heavily in George Jackson's book. He talks about the necessity of violence. So let's get started with page 6, talking about Black liberals. He says their line is, "Ain't nobody but Black folks gonna die in a revolution." This argument completely overlooks the fact that we, Black people, have always done most of the dying and still do, dying at the stake through social neglect or in US foreign wars. The point is now to construct a situation where someone else will join in the dying. If it fails and we have to do most of the dying anyway, we're certainly no worse off than before. So violence is a necessity. To continue on page 9, George Jackson says, to the slave, revolution is an imperative, a love-inspired, conscious act of desperation. It's aggressive. It isn't cool or cautious. It's bold, audacious, violent, an expression of icy, disdainful hatred. It can hardly be any other way without raising a fundamental contradiction. And to continue, short quote on page 14. Uh, he says, if terror is going to be the choice of weapons, there must be funerals on both sides. It's badass. I love it. Next one, on page 35, on 135, talking again about the necessity of violence, just to hammer in this point. We will not succeed until we fully accept the fact that the enemy is aware, determined, disguised, totalitarian, and mercilessly counter-revolutionary. Our insistence on military action, defensive and retaliatory, has nothing to do with romanticism or precipitous idealistic fervor. We want to be effective. We want to live. Violence is necessary. Here, starting at this point, in the video, I'm going to start sharing some of George Jackson's more explicit discussions about violence, not in the abstract. Actually, sorry, to begin with, I'm going to start with a quote by Jonathan Jackson, who you will remember is George Jackson's 16-year-old brother. He says, why do we go for this old shit? Most of the fascist functionaries live as unguarded as I do. I could slip a knife between Max Rafferty's ribs, the Agnews and DuPonts, the Rockefellers and Morgans, all of the Getty, Hunt, and Hughes types who sneak around in armored cars and jets are just as reachable. Anyone who will come out of his bomb shelter can be had. We just saw an interesting thing with the United Healthcare CEO just recently, which this reminds me a bit of. To continue on page 32, this one, I might have to split this up for the sake of YouTube, but I'm going to try to do my best to keep this as pure, as pure as it is in the book. This one, George Jackson says, there are many thousands of ways to correct individuals. The best way is to send one armed expert. I don't mean to outshout him with logic. I mean correct him, slay him, assassinate him with thuggee, by silenced pistol, shotgun, with a high-powered rifle shooting from 400 yards away and behind a rock. Suffocation, strangulation, crucifixion, burning with a flamethrower, dispatch by bomb. Auto accidents happen all day. People drown, get poleaxed, breathe noxious gases, get stabbed, get poisoned with bad water, ratsbane, germicides, hemlock, arsenic, strychnine, LSD-25 concentrate, cyanide, hydrocyanic acid, vitriol. A snake could bite him. Nicotine oil is deadly. An overdose of dope. There's deadly nightshade, belladonna, datura, wolfsbane, foxglove, aconite, ptomaine, botulism, and the death of 1,000 cuts. But a curse won't work. the whole book is filled with discussions like these. That one is probably my favorite section. But again, I really want to recommend that everybody read this just to sort of get the feeling of what George Jackson is saying. Here's one more quote about violence in general on page 61. George Jackson says, a $100,000 tank can be destroyed with $2 worth of materials. I want to remind everybody that this book was written 50 years ago. And so the high cost of equipment is now much higher. The low cost of equipment is basically the same. So to start again, sorry, a $100,000 tank can be destroyed with $2 worth of materials. A jet is useless against the rifleman, and it also can be destroyed with one well-placed burst from an assault rifle or destroyed on the ground by mortar from miles away. Then, too, the pilot, years in the making, can be killed with a knife. The copter, as a fighting machine, is the most stupid of all the costly gadgets. It can be heard from miles away. It can't be armored. A 10-cent bullet can render it useless. All of these contraptions require liquid fuels that will stop flowing when the production of all the other commodities stops. Fighting really depends upon the people and small, easily machined portable weapons. This one is especially interesting. When I started making my notes for this book, a video was going around of Palantir, an array of drones that looked really, really expensive. It looked really, really impressive. It looked like there was a lot of very expensive technology that goes into these drones. A drone is basically four little rotor things that spin around that make it fly. Any one of which that gets disables the entire thing, right? Same principle as what George Jackson is talking about here. So I don't know if this is going to make it onto YouTube. If it does, I hope so. Okay, let's talk next about the vanguard and guerrilla tactics. Like I said before, one of the reasons that I love this book so much is that it gave me sort of newfound belief that the things that we're talking about, making a meaningful change and doing things that actually help people, are within our grasp. And these are the sections of the book that I think really hit me. That really hit me whenever I read them. And so I want to share these sections of the book. But again, I want to remind everybody, please read this book. If it sounds anything that you might be interested in, please give it a try. So to get started, let's talk about the vanguard in general. Here we go, this one. In the opening stages of such a conflict, before a unified left can be established, before most people have accepted the inevitability of war, before we are able militarily to organize massive violence, we must depend on limited, selective violence tied to an exact political purpose. In the early service of the people, there must be totally committed professional revolutionaries who understand that all human life is meaningless if it is not accompanied by the controls that determine its quality. I am one of these. Classic conversation about the vanguard. George Jackson did not make up this concept, but I think it's really interesting and useful to realize how he adapted it to his situation in the early 1970s. And perhaps that we should be thinking about how to adapt it to ourselves in the mid 2020s. To continue, so on page 76, he adds, this one. Like I said before, one of the things that this book made me believe is that we don't need to have overpowering force to win. There's a really, really great section about a somewhat scientific study and a somewhat scientific understanding about how many fighters, how many military fighters it takes to take down or to handle or control one guerrilla fighter. And he says that it is 10 to 1. So I'm going to read a section of this one, but this is another section that I think everybody should read on their own. Any honest expert in the overall strategy and logistics of classic Western mechanized warfare, the war of the industrially based established states, will admit that the scientific guerrilla force must be outnumbered 10 to 1 in manpower by the mechanized force if it is to be contained at all. Really, really great section. And just for no reason whatsoever, I want to remind people that there's about 500,000 US soldiers worldwide. So just for no reason whatsoever. Next one, on page 42. He has a little bit longer of a quote here. This one talking about the Vanguard and talking about, again, the theme of the entire book is death. Jonathan Jackson's death was on his mind, and so I think he is thinking about John as he's writing this one. But he says, these comrades, the Vanguard, must make the first contribution. They will be the first to fall. We gather up their bodies, clean them, kiss them, and smile. Their funerals should be gala affairs of home-brewed wine and revolutionary music to do the dance of death by. We should be sad only that it's taken us so many generations to produce them. Really beautiful. And again, talking about it so lovingly makes me think that he must be thinking about his own younger brother at this time. Finally, uh, this one, talking about low numbers of combatants. There's this nice little section on page 83 that I think is also quite interesting, just to sort of hammer home the point that it doesn't take large numbers of people to make meaningful change. The larger and more complex the city states, the more it is dependent upon all related parts. The cannon was hit at its base in the moving parts of its treads, which were destroyed, and the death machine fell of its own weight. How can the super technological state operate without electricity or power, without water, transport, communications, sewage systems, utilities? None of these can be protected. Their sheer size alone makes it impossible. How can the establishment protect an electrical supply and the thousands of transformers, etc.? Effective positioning of the guards is militarily impossible. A man every 25 feet up and down the million miles of line can't protect it. It would also break the class that paid for the protection, since a break at any one point renders powerless huge sections of the area served. I think this is the essence of the poor man's war, the essence of the guerrilla strategy, the protracted war of the worker bees. A little twist on Mao there. I like it. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, so that's going to just about do it for my summary of the book. I left out a few significant portions. In one of the letters, George Jackson gives kind of a summary, an overview of history as he sees it. That in and of itself is kind of a condensed version of history, so it wouldn't really be useful for me to give a condensed version of that. Again, I want to remind everybody, this is really, really a book that I hope everybody reads. Next month, we're going to be going over Lenin's Imperialism, the highest current form of capitalism, which, as this wordy, bulky title seems to imply, is a book that I think everybody sort of needs a little bit of help with, and that I'm happy to provide that. But this is a book that you really, really need to experience it for yourself, and I want everybody to read it on their own. With that in mind, I would like to close it out with one more quote from George Jackson talking about himself. This one on page 181. And I'm going to read this mostly in its entirety. As you know, I'm in a unique political position. I have a very nearly closed future, and since I have always been inclined to get disturbed over organized injustice or terrorist practice against the innocents, wherever, I can now say just about what I want. I've always done just about that, without fear of self-exposure. I can only be executed once. So I rage on, aggressive and free. When I am denied or corrected, I always understand, but rage on. All on the principle that the ideal must be demonstrated, that the oppressed mentality must be taught by example to escape the myth, the hoax that repression can work against the collective consciousness of the commune, and to prove that ideals cannot be killed with violence. And later on, he says, I am alive and learning. I Am Alive and Learning was almost the name of the study group that I chose just because I love it so much. This is at the end of the book. The entire book was about violence, dying a good death, was about being placed in an impossible situation and doing your very, very best. And at the very end of it, he says, I am alive and learning. And I think that that is the best that we all can do. That is what we should all aspire to do. Be alive and learn. Thank you again, everybody. I'll see you next month for Vladimir Lenin. See you.